first of all, hi, my name is Abby Covert. My pronouns are she and her. I am the Chief Sense Maker here at the Sense Makers Club. If you have not been to the Sense Makers Club before, we do have quite a few rules that I want to go through up front. First, to uphold our values, we do follow a strict code of conduct. So if you haven't yet, please do check out a link to that in the chat. The main purpose of that code of conduct is to keep kindness at the center of the club. So we keep two things in mind for that during our discussions. The number one is pause before responding. So if the body starts to feel a certain way because of a thing that somebody said, just give it a sec before you hit the hand up button. And then assume best intentions. Like, everyone's here to learn, everyone's here to grow. We all don't have editors on our mouths, so sometimes we say dumb things. So let's all assume best intentions when people make us feel weird, which is inevitable to happen with this many people on a web call. Rules for today's discussion: no interrupting. We like to use the mute feature. We like to use the hand raise feature to make sure that we keep the speaker as the focus. The chat is only for questions and comments. We try to limit side conversations and crosstalk, and we try to keep our responses to under 2 minutes. So if you do get a chance to speak today, try to keep that in mind. If you see me dancing down here in my little box, you might be talking too long. So just keep that in mind. That's kind of like the digital barber pole that I'm pulling you through on. Now, Google Meet Notes, your camera is totally optional. We call that podcast mode. That is totally cool with us. If you feel like you want to contribute by voice, that's awesome. We do not require seeing your bad hair day. That's totally cool. Using the hand raise feature is required. You won't be in the speaking queue if not. We can't see physical hands, especially in a room this large. So please find the feature in Google Meet. You are being recorded right now, but you are free to leave at any time. So if being recorded is not your jam, that's totally cool. We won't have you on the recording unless you are the one that is in focus speaking. Using emojis to react is our primary way of saying to the speaker that we know what they're saying and that we are picking up what they're putting down. And it's also a way that you can tell me right now that you know how to use that feature and that you understand the rules. So if everybody can find an emoji, throw it down. Awesome, seeing those come through. Lastly, very important, if anybody does have a personal note taker that joins today, it will be kicked out. So just letting you know that we will proactively look through the attendees list. And if that happens too many times, I might reach out to you to check your settings and just make sure that that's not happening. Any questions on the rules, since we have a bunch of new faces today, before we get into today's topic? No? Awesome. All right. Well, I am very excited about today's topic. The reason that we are here is because Larry has been a faithful member of the IA Office Hours tribe for quite a number of years now. And we often get into these conversations about the role of AI and IA. And so this like overlap of these two things has really come into the conversation in so many different ways. And there was a conversation a couple months back at the club where Larry really went deep with a guest speaker on some pretty nerdy stuff when it comes to thinking about the overlap between neural network approaches and symbolic AI approaches. So you don't need to know what any of those words mean. That's the really good news, because I have a feeling that at the end of Larry's little introduction, you will know what all of those words mean. And with that, I'd love to have Larry introduce himself and then take us away.
Hey, it's great to be here. Should I start? Let me start sharing. So I've got that set up. So as Abby said, I'm a long time, I'm a Zoom person. I'm learning to navigate. Here we go. There. So Abby and I had a great chat last week. Are you all seeing my screen okay? Excellent, okay. Abby and I had a great chat last week about, you're just kind of setting up for this. And one of the things that we decided was that it would be good to kind of set the stage a little bit. The first part of setting the stage is me and my background. I'm just like an old internet guy. I've been doing stuff since the original .com boom. Have mostly in kind of from publishing to marketing to UX design to content strategy to enterprise stuff. And then the last 4 or 5 years, I've kind of been immersed in the knowledge graph and knowledge representation and semantic worlds, and kind of which seemed like a logical and natural extension of my career. And I'm hoping some of you see logical and obvious ways to extend your career after we chat about this stuff. And so what, like Abby said, we had this, it comes up all the time in these SenseMaker Club conversations, things around LLMs and other kinds of artificial intelligence. So anyhow, so what Abby and I talked about last week was like, it just seems like this just kind of came out of the blue like 2.5 years ago when ChatGPT dropped, and we've all just been kind of, like struggling to catch up ever since. So what I wanted to do is I'm going to start with just a little historical overview and sort of a contextual overview of what AI, my little tiny lizard brain understanding of AI and its role in our world as information architects. And I don't know, that's something we didn't talk about, Abby, but I'm just going to assume that there's at least an interest in information architecture among the folks who've come today, and kind of anchor things in IA practice. But I've done a lot, like I said, I've done a lot of other stuff, publishing and media stuff and other things, and that'll pop in as well. But like I've got a little presentation here, but feel free to interrupt even as I'm going. I'll try to get my screen set up so I can see hands raised. I may ask you all for help on that too. So anyhow, we feel like AI has just dropped in out of the blue, but actually it's been going on forever. I kind of augment this screen. I asked ChatGPT to put together a timeline for me of significant events in AI history. And because this is small, I've kind of augmented this. In 1943, this is arguably when the whole neural network stuff started. This was, McCulloch and Pitts came up with the first mathematical model of human neurons and human brain stuff. So this is arguably, that's where it starts. 1950, the Turing test, you probably all heard about this, Alan Turing's idea of like, creating a machine that is indistinguishable. Like how do you tell if a machine is indistinguishable from a human? There was I forget the exact topic of the conference, but there was this conference in Dartmouth in 1956 where the term artificial intelligence was first coined. So this stuff goes back almost 70 years. The first chatbot, this freaked me out to remember, because I knew people who were doing stuff with Eliza like in the 80s, and I thought that was cool and old-timey, but Eliza was actually created in 1965. In the kind of the late 60s, early 70s, 80s, all this stuff like reasoning systems, expert systems, there was this sort of expert systems boom through the 80s. And then this technology called description logics. I won't, again, all this stuff, any one of these things is like somebody's whole PhD thesis, so I won't go deep into any of this. This one is significant logic. You'll see the role of logic in comparisons of different kinds of AI in a little bit. And so that goes back to 1985. This is like 40 years since, there's been logically based programming languages available. Then there's this famous thing in the like kind of mid to late 80s and into the 90s of the AI winter. And some people see, anyhow, that's a whole other conversation. Like we'll talk in a little bit about pendulums swinging and ebbs and flows of stuff. But through the 80s, you'll see that there's not, ChatGPT couldn't find anything for the next 10 years until 97 when Deep Blue beat Kasparov in a chess match. And then we're beginning to see like kind of the lexical and language and semantic stuff begin. In 1998, there was this project called WordNet, which is basically, I don't know, kind of think of like a giant glossary or thesaurus of terms that, is computable and usable by folks. The semantic web was introduced. I don't know if any of you, I remember it clearly the day I used to subscribe to the print edition of Scientific American. And so sometime in April of 2001, I read the May 2001 article by Tim Berners-Lee and Ora Lassila and Jim Hendler about the semantic web. And I'm kind of, if I seem excited sometimes throughout this, that's because we're finally there. 25 years later, we finally are seeing, I mean, actually a lot of stuff, as you'll see, a lot of stuff's been going on, but it's really fun to see this finally coming to fruition. But that's 25 years ago that the semantic web and ontology practice was first created. Deep learning starts, and you'll see that learning is a huge part of the large language model, the neural network side of things. So deep learning was a significant advance. Google introduced their knowledge graph. Well, they didn't introduce it publicly for about 5 more years. But in 2007, I think it was when they acquired, I forget the name of that company where Denny Vranjicic was working. Anyhow, they began working on their internal knowledge graph, which was sort of like, I don't know, arguably one of the first operational large-scale knowledge graph applications in an enterprise. There's also stuff, like we think of AI as LLMs. There's this whole world of image stuff. And in 2012, there was this, that CNN stands for convolutional neural networks. It was this amazing advance in the ability of neural network technology to recognize images and properly identify them. So that's been going on. Word2Vec, another, this is like the foundation of the ability to vectorize word embeddings. GANs, I only know about this because my sister's a medical researcher and works with radiology and imaging analysis. And this stands for generative adversarial networks. It's an image comparison technology that's been really important in her work in cancer detection. Transformers. Now we're getting into the modern era where you probably started to hear about a lot of this stuff. 2017 was that famous paper where attention is all you need. You may have heard that phrase floating around. And that's the transformer technology that kind of, again, I'm not the most technical person in the world, but as I understand it, this is the thing that kind of took NLP out of its old school ways and began the march to current LLMs and the current wave of language stuff. And then in 2019, this is 6 years ago, the first GPT from actually there was another one before this. I just didn't have enough pixels on the screen to get them all in there. But there was an early GPT introduced. Then there's also, like in this 2021, again, less than 5 years ago, this is GNNs or graph neural networks, the intersection of neural network stuff and graph shaped data and in a neural network setting. 2022, we all remember ChatGPT. It's all been crazy since then. 2023, the explosion of LLMs. And then we get up to the present day almost, knowledge graphs and LLMs as a trend emerging in these, what we'll call hybrid architectures. And we'll talk a lot more about that. So that's a quick, that's probably as quick a survey of AI history as anyone's ever done. But I just want to point out that there's a whole lot of stuff that leads up to this conversation about the intersection of neural network-based, language models and knowledge representation and symbolic AI models like knowledge graphs. And that's where we are today. The other thing, I went to another of those services out there. I asked Claude to tell me about the relative prominence of different kinds of AI technology over each decade, because that's how people kind of feel this, like especially the old-timey AI folks. They're just like, like in the like today we just think it's all machine learning and NLP and all that stuff all the time. But if you look early on, the first half of this evolution of stuff, it was largely about symbolic AI, expert systems, a lot of kind of reasoning kinds of stuff that isn't still to this day isn't really a capability of LLMs. There's also been the last 40 years this nice little undercurrent, not super prominent, but it's always been there. The knowledge representation, knowledge graphs, these kind of knowledge technologies that we'll talk about. So Frank von Harmelen, he's a AI researcher based in Amsterdam. He talks about those eras I just showed. He sees it as kind of a pendulum swinging back and forth. Right now, the pendulum is swung kind of to this side of the connectionist. What connectionist refers to like neural networks, the connecty kind of stuff, like nodes connected to other nodes, and mostly about working with data. That's the column of text here on the left. Data is the fuel for this. Statistics are the methods by which you are working with this data, and it's all about learning. Whereas the other side of the equation, you have like the connection, the contrast with connectionist technologies, you have symbolic technologies. Like a classic example of how, like Frank explains this, is that like you could, like if you ask an LLM to add 3 and 5 together, they can just guess all day, based on their word salad, evaluation of a bunch of vectorized things about math. Or you could turn those numbers into symbols, ask a math thingy to add them, and then give it back. So that's the sort of symbolic, like working with symbols rather than just raw connections between stuff. Like I said, the raw fodder for large language models is data, and they just are hungry for data. They need a lot of data to work properly. Knowledge representations, systems obviously are based on knowledge. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But the difference, it really gets your brain going to think about the difference between data and knowledge and all this stuff in between. Like I said before, the main kind of methodological thing that's happening with LLMs and neural network technologies, it's statistical analysis. It's just, linear algebra applied to a bunch of vectorized word embeddings to predict next token generation and stuff. Whereas in knowledge systems, you have logic that you can bring into play, which turns out to be very important. And finally, the neural network things they're largely about kind of like the human brain. They're kind of like learning. They're like those connections are like, oh, every time this happens, I see that, or it's kind of like not impression, well, maybe impressionistic, but this sort of but they're mostly about learning. Whereas knowledge-based systems are more about reasoning. You can actually reason over stuff. And again, this goes way deeper than we can talk in detail here. But that's sort of a summary. One of the points that falls out of that last comparison is and this is, I think, where a lot of people are concerned about LLM technology right now, and just its toll on the planet and the amount of compute cycles it takes to do a lot of stuff. It's why would you learn? Why would you spend all these computer cycles on learning something that you already know? And this gets into the whole field of getting knowledge representation into AI systems. It's kind of like efficiency. It's like if you're a responsible product manager, why would you spend $100,000 a month at OpenAI when you could just have a knowledge graph that has, or a knowledge base of some kind that has things you already know? Again, and kind of back to that, what I was saying a minute ago, these systems are kind of like Kahneman's. If you all know Kahneman's thinking fast and slow idea, the systems one thinking is really fast. It's like your intuition, your gut instincts, your innate stuff. It's kind of like again, kind of about learning. It's quicker. It's the thinking fast part. Whereas systems two thinking is the slow thinking, more patient, more it's knowledge driven. There's more effort to it, but the effort yields more accurate and quicker results. So this analogy comes up all the time between LLMs and knowledge representation models, that LLM system one and knowledge representation system two. And this has even shown up last year in industry analysts. Last year, the two things at the center of Gartner's impact radar were knowledge graphs and generative AI. So this is not just science, it's like business too. And a quick thing just to observe that, the language models, they talk about large language models, but they're really math. Like I said, they're mathematical analysis of vectorized representations of words. And so so I sometimes wonder if LLM, is it large language models or is it large learning models? That's how I'm starting to think of them in my head. And don't repeat this because I don't want to get in trouble with the people who coined those words, because I'm sure they have good reasons for calling it that. But this is something that's always in the back of my head. Now, when we really start talking about language, I'm just going to leave this meme here on the screen for a minute and let this sink in. If you can't see it, if your resolution isn't good enough, this guy is pounding nails in the sand at that liminal zone where the sea is hitting the shore. And he's, that's just all of humanity doing our best with language to describe the edges of the inheritably indescribable nature of the universe. So language is tough stuff. And I think I was just talking to a friend this morning, a very prominent, one of the world's best known ontologists, anyhow, she, in passing, with no prompting on my part, talked about the hubris of machine learning engineers and how they think they can fix or learn anything with their power. And I'm like, yeah, sometimes it's worth a little bit of human work to work out these language issues, to agree on what you're talking about. Anyhow, but the point of this is the point that there's, to the extent that language is involved in all of this stuff, we, the people in this field, like information architecture, content strategy, UX design, writing talent of various kinds, we're the people who are extremely well suited to a lot of this new work that's emerging right now. It's really, and this is where I think this is why Abby is a little nervous about this conversation. Is like right now, it's like it's all LLMs and machine learning all the time, and I think there's really a place for people like us. Like I'm speaking for myself and a lot of the people I've met in the knowledge graph and semantic communities who come out of like the humanities or philosophy, which is also the foundation of the ontological basis of knowledge graphs. You know, that's where that comes from. You know, literature and music and history, all of these fields have been represented in people I've met working in the knowledge graph space. And especially, and more recently, library science. There's people like Jessica Talisman, for example. She's the lead IA at Adobe, has some really brilliant ideas. She spoke at Content Design, Connected Data London, the big one of the big knowledge graph conferences last year. So this is just by way of saying that like language is not just math. There's a lot of human stuff that goes with it, and we are among the best positioned people to do the human stuff, I think, that goes with this. And a lot of that human stuff is about ascribing meaning to all these words that are floating around, you know, sometimes called semantics, you know, the practice of semantics. And this is just a super quick overview of like what some people call the semantic spectrum. You know, we kind of, once you have words that you kind of agreed on, you can just say, okay, we're going to use these words to talk about stuff. You'll have like a term list or something like that. And then maybe you put them in some kind of a list, you know, so they're even a little more organized. You might have to define them to, you know, in a glossary. You might organize them hierarchically in a taxonomy to help, you know, just to put things in context to one another. You might also need something like a thesaurus to differentiate the same terms that have, you know, like you have a preferred term in one place, but it's a different term used in another place. You're talking about the same thing. And then the logical extension of that is you get out to a full-blown ontology where you have and the thing with an ontology is it's not just words at this point. You're talking about concepts that are connected, and this is kind of like, I mean, not like the pinnacle, but it's like it's fairly advanced in semantics, you know, to get to the point of where you all can agree on concepts that you're talking about in a domain. And I want to go a little bit deeper into that because a lot of all these words we're talking about, typically there's labels for a word, but it's really the underlying concept that people should take an interest in. And again, this is a thing that people, I was talking to another, no, it wasn't a friend, I was on it was a podcast I listened to last week. I forget who was talking. Oh, I know, it was Mike Dillinger, who's the guy who built the knowledge graph at LinkedIn. And he was talking about these poor engineers at LinkedIn forced to try to get people to agree on language. And he was talking about how traumatized they were at these human activities. And I'm like, hey, that's what we do all day. You know, we talk to each other about like, hey, what do you mean when you say that? What do you mean? So anyhow, so any one concept can have a lot of different labels. But it's, and this kind of gets into like, if you've ever heard that thing that Google says about their knowledge graph, it's about things, not strings. Those concepts are things, you know, that everybody can agree on. You might call it a silla in Spanish and a chair in English, but it's still a chair. There's still a thing you can sit on that has some legs and a back maybe. And so that string kind of fades in importance, and it's really the conceptual things we're talking about that you want to keep in mind, or at least have that distinction in mind. And again, this, when you're talking about knowledge representation, you're talking about agreement on what the things are, not just a bunch of words that describe that thing. And this brings us back to that pendulum. So you can kind of add to this list things on the knowledge side, and strings, you know, being the more concern of the other side. But Frank also says that like he hopes that we're in an area like, you know, this idea of a pendulum swinging back and forth. He's hoping that we're at a point where this pendulum will settle down finally, and we'll just be in the middle, and which is in fact what's happening in many, especially AI architectures and enterprises. It's almost always, virtually always now, some kind of hybrid system, whether it's RAG or full-blown neuro-symbolic AI with knowledge graphs and fancy stuff connecting it. So there's some hope that the relative, and we can talk a lot more about the relative power and benefits and detriments of each kind of AI, but hopefully his hope is that we'll land somewhere in the middle of that. So that's a lot of me talking. Let's talk about this stuff.
That was awesome, Larry. Thank you so much for that very very beautiful overview. I feel more educated for sure. I felt like the historical background was great, and there was definitely some mind-blowing parts to it. So I feel like Daphne had a question to revisit the AI pendulum slide. Daphne, do you want to come on mic and give some context to your question?
Absolutely. When I think of the AI pendulum in my life, my default stance is AI at one end and human at the other, as opposed to, I realized that was a representation of the pendulum within AI itself, but I wanted Larry's 2 cents on, and you got into it a bit when you got to the page about the musicians and philosophers, but I was just curious to hear you speak a bit about AI and humans and where we are. I realize we're going to go back and forth for years the way others of these things have gone back and forth for years. I won't say which of the things Larry put on the timeline were after I graduated college. I just let that ride for today. Thanks.
Hey, Daphne, it's great to see you.
Hey, Larry.
Yeah, it's and I swear Daphne's a friend, and I did not plant her, but that was a perfect question because I'm actually interviewing that guy I mentioned, Frank von Hammerlin, for my podcast later tonight. And one of his current activity is called hybrid intelligence, which is, you will love this idea. It's the idea of like, it's about hybrid, it's about humans and AI, being I don't think he uses the pendulum analogy there, but it's exactly what you just said. It's like, I think that's an equally, if not more valid way to look at it. Like, this is or should be in service to people, not Silicon Valley bankers, one would hope. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like the pendulum thing was interesting to think about, but I have it more in my brain as like a spectrum, and the spectrum that I have is like between reactive and proactive. Like it feels like with both AI and human intervention that we're kind of organization by organization deciding like where we're putting those resources. Are we putting them reactively in things like moderation, or are we putting them proactively in things like, better training data? And it feels like there's like a real tension about like where to put the resources, but there is a lot of, to your point, Larry, there's an admission that you need both. It's just like, what's the unique balance in that spectrum that you achieve with your organization?
Sorry, the reason I'm laughing is just yesterday on LinkedIn, somebody shared a comic of a, kind of to what you were just saying, of some people sitting in a conference room going, how can we make this AI thing perform better? Hey, we could throw more CPUs at it, we could do this. And one guy raised his hand and goes, we could do better with our data. And they literally threw him out the window of a skyscraper. So, so your point is well taken, and, yes. And almost like it's a shame. And that's an ongoing area of concern that like I run a weekly meetup called the Data Worthy Collective, and it's mostly about knowledge graphs and semantic stuff, but it's a lot about data hygiene, data literacy, data everything. And we're just like, oh, for crying out loud, that's a whole other can of worms about the emphasis of LLMs on they're so proud of their ability to work with unstructured data. And we're over here in the IA world going, actually, we've done a lot of work that would make you a lot easier for you to understand that stuff you're working with.
Yeah, no, I had the distinct pleasure, I suppose, of building what someone referred to as a toy taxonomy. And it was to teach the machine learning engineers that it really was worth a human telling a machine a little bit more about gemstones to sell more jewelry on a major website. So I feel like there's like examples through my whole career of times where I have to be like the human intervention to prove that it's worth acknowledging that the structuring of data is worth saving the machines from having to do the structuring of data. It's sort of like a push and pull of like, whose resources are you going to use? Because the data needs structuring. We're just arguing about who's structuring it and based on what logic, to your point.
Yeah, there's also like a little bit of, not two-way street isn't the exact right word, but there's also this whole world of knowledge extraction, not extraction, but like knowledge capture, like the whole field of knowledge management, which is bizarrely disconnected from knowledge graphs. That's a whole other conversation to have.
Totally.
Yeah, because the short version of that, gross oversimplification, is that knowledge management is largely concerned with documents, whereas knowledge graphs and knowledge representation is largely concerned with more granular and graphy representations of knowledge. So yeah, it's
Yeah, it's strings, things, and some other things. I mean, like, I don't know what those, the documents are definitely not the strings, and they're not the things that you were
Yeah.
talking about. There's some other thing
They're
that
another
we
thing.
also
Yeah,
have to deal with.
exactly.
I mean, we could talk about PDFs for an entire session as well. I think we have in the past.
And if you really want to traumatize me, you can mention SharePoint.
Oh my gosh, my very first IA job was working in SharePoint. We should talk about that at some point. Okay,
Yeah.
well, let's get to Kyle has a question. Kyle, do you want to come on and give some context to your question?
Sure.
Awesome.
Appreciate the discussion. I was like insta signed up for this one. This is such in my wheelhouse of passion areas. So I was fascinated by this Anthropic article, and the link that I shared is like the
Let me look in the
general
chat.
general population version, and there's a giant research paper behind that article too. And the researchers are trying to peer into the black box of these really complicated systems, and what they see emergent as like a behavior that's studyable and like provable, and they can mess with the parameters, is like there are concepts in these models, concepts for bigness, concepts for smallness, those being related to each other, concepts for capitals, and they kind of prove that the model is like using some of these intermediate concepts before it reaches its next token. So like the neurons are firing that I'm going to need to fill something small or big in this slot in my output. I find that fascinating. You know, as IAs and people who are more on the human side of it, I think it's really interesting to also study these properties that seem very human that are done that these systems can do too. So there's some appreciation. I agree with the humility argument, maybe lacking. However, there's some really cool stuff that if we get the IAs in the room to study and think about and collaborate with these issues, I think we'll arrive at some better technology. So the question was, had you been exposed to this and seen any?
I have not seen. It's funny. I don't know how anybody keeps up these days, and I'm falling behind. I've been reading all the Anthropic stuff I've read lately is about like MCP and stuff like that. But anyhow, no, I'll read that. But one thing to that, just that. Well, there's so much to that, but there's something I was going to say. Sorry, it slipped my mind because I'm thinking ahead already. No, but that. Oh, I know what I was going to say. Is that every human has both systems 1 and 2 thinking, and I think that's why I don't know that this analogy holds exactly between LLMs and knowledge and symbolic AI is like systems 1 and 2, but it's very close and close enough. And I think you're right that like there's a huge amount to learn from both, and like. Just as like, and this again gets back to the knowledge capture, like why would you learn something that you already know? So I think it's kind of us, and again, this is an architecture thing. Like if you're designing any kind of like information or knowledge architecture, it's like, I think it's your job to go like, is this known knowledge that we can just get, from a database or from a data source of some kind, or do we need to figure this out? And that's sort of the dichotomy I'm seeing. And again, that's just, like systems architecture.
I think it doesn't take into account the hallucination effect of AI. Like it's not that the AI will tell you that it doesn't have enough data to complete it. If you're talking about LLMs, it's a pleasing machine. So it will write something that pleases you into believing that it, like for example, with the toy taxonomy example that I give you, I'm sure that at this point, you could ask any of the LLMs, what is the gemstone that is associated with each month for a birth month? But at the time, that was something that you had to go into like Wikipedia pages and random books about gems and like come to some decision. And there was a decision where those things changed at some point during some period of time. And those things are different at different places in geography across the world. All things that a human who can put their special interest power on something can learn really quickly from these various sources. But there's this point with AI where you don't know if it's hallucinating or if it's actually providing the correct source for the thing. So back to my reactive proactive, you're either putting people in the reactive space of having to react to the thing the AI said and saying like, hey, is that really true that it is a Ruby for that particular month? Or you're putting them in the proactive spot of just telling the machine that Ruby is associated with that month. And it's like you're paying the cost in one spot or another. Yeah. I'd love to hear from folks examples of like this work being done in our space. Does anybody have any relevant examples where they're sort of touching on these spaces overlapping? Yeah, Mike.
Hello. Yeah, I mean, admittedly, I'm doing it through personal projects, but I also think that's one of the tremendous boons of this revolution, which is that talk about bicycle for the mind. I mean, we're automating cognition and empowering ourselves to build these things. So I've been doing a lot of work building structured content out of unstructured, very unstructured, indeed fictional material. So I'm converting TV scripts into knowledge graphs, which is fun. And what I found is that it's because these things are, the generative pre-trained transformers, what they do best of all is they turn input into output, is that you can use them to re-render content, essentially. And not only turn structured content, unstructured content into structured content, but through the reasoning engine that they are, be able to kind of expand on that content and enrich it with insights that have come from the LLM, but are still very much grounded in the, in the source content. Which means, to your point, Abby, about hallucinations and things like that, when you then no longer relying on the LLM's parametric brain to the fact that it can answer a question accurately at all is kind of a miracle given how it works. Instead, you're using it to intelligently look up sources from graphs or even from vector databases or both, and have those responses much more grounded in reality.
Who can speak to the skill set? Like, what is the skill set? If I'm a person on this call and I'm listening to this and I'm like, man, I want to get into that from a hobbyist perspective. Like, what does it look like? If you're coming specifically from, a traditional knowledge management or librarianship background, which I think we have quite a number of folks in that camp.
I think Mike is the best person to answer that question.
Yeah, Mike.
Seriously.
What's it look like? What's the cross training?
It's a whole load of free tools, which is I mean, my tool chain is a free IDE from Google, Firebase Studio. It's free Python libraries. I use something called BAML, which is absolutely bulletproof at turning unstructured content into structured content. And then I'm sitting all day, with the various LLMs. I sit all day in AI Studio for Gemini or Claude, and ChatGPT, of course. And I'm working up my crazy ideas into something that eventually becomes what the kids are calling vibe code. And very, very quickly you can scaffold something up. You can take an idea for a walk. And for me, and I think a lot of people in our field, when I look at the subtext of a lot of these conversations, which is how do we deliver the clue train to the people who don't want to know, you can kind of either make a stronger argument or subvert some of that by taking it out of the theoretical guesswork and all the kind of big bet up front of building a data model and is this going to be the right thing before we really commit to the work. And actually, instead, doing an end-to-end experimentation, running the thing through the whole pipeline, seeing how it comes out, tweaking, iterating within, days, not weeks or months.
Yeah, that's great advice. How about other folks? What other experiences do we have on this call? We have such a broad range of folks. Other people are working on this. Yeah, Deborah.
Yeah, so I'm working on it more from the perspective of building websites, and I'm working with a client right now we're reorganizing our IA to expand what is like the perception of what's in AI of our topic. So it's just like a leadership framework, goal setting framework, and the AI's knowledge stops at a certain point. And I mean, the idea of the framework and the content is to not tell people the exact right answers, and that's what AI wants to do. So we're really trying through the information architecture and through reorganizing our content, which has basically just been like single feed content, into organizing it in a way that a crawler, a search, whether for search or for or an LLM crawler, can better organize and make those connections between this specific goal setting framework and leadership and like bigger ideas. And it is I would say it's like slightly structured. Like we're structuring the website. It is the information architecture and we're building it in, but we're doing it specifically to speak to both people and large language models, which will hopefully pick up our stuff, and not someone else's. So, yeah.
Oh, that's so interesting. That reminds me of the years of figuring out how to get Google to recognize your things or various search engines in the right way. And it's like that's just the next pendulum swing, I guess, Larry, in today's technology.
Yeah. A quick aside on that. If you don't follow Andrea Volpini at WordLift, WordLift is a plugin for WordPress that does like basically builds a knowledge graph about your website. It's a great way to explain to Google what you're doing. You know, it's like to converse with Google's knowledge graph. But Andrea is also like one of the most, he's like a lot of people in the knowledge graph side of things, extremely conversant in the whole stack of AI, LLMs and old school, NLP and other technologies. And he recently did a thing, Deborah, that I think you would really appreciate, where he was in real time, he was getting social media coverage that he could demonstrate at a conference. He was speaking at an AI conference, and he showed that he could influence, I think it was Grok was the LLM he was influencing, and somebody did a Twitter search during his talk and said, what's the most compelling thing you've seen at this conference? And it was like, well, Andrea Volpini said this thing about blah, blah, blah. So here's a guy who's walking the talk. So
yeah, that's cool.
Awesome. Marion, I thought I saw your hand go up. Did you have a second thought on your first thought?
Well, I was trying to type it out a bit, and I'm in a coffee shop, so it's, but I feel like Deborah was getting at something that I think about a lot in terms of that it's possible to create content that's kind of ideal for both systems. And something I feel like I keep running into is that people tend to just continue leaving the topic of existing data out of the conversation. Like the bot's not working, it's hallucinating, it's doing this thing. And I feel like there's so many of us over in the corner, like we need to fix the docs. We need to go in and like clean them up, basically, just fix what's already there, make it even just a little bit cleaner. Maybe we play with a style guideline. Like things like that can make a big difference. And I've seen it work, but then it feels like that's always kind of shrugged off. And I'm wondering if like talking in terms of knowledge graphs or something like that, especially when we don't have like the structured authoring systems where we're kind of creating as much structure as we can without touching any kind of code. And things like that, or like we don't necessarily have access to the engineering to make whatever systems, but I feel like I keep running into people who are like, well, we're going to tweak the bot's code this way, or we're going to write just for the system and not for everyone. And I feel like it's possible to treat these systems as just another audience. And there's ways to do that, but it's very frustrating that these conversations continue to like, there's some kind of like what you mentioned before, this disconnect between knowledge management and knowledge graphs. Knowledge graphs, I feel like that's worth talking more about because they are so incredibly related. But yeah, that's more or less.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating. I mean, like, I'm wondering what you're talking about. Like, is it really just better document hygiene and semantic structuring that we should be like more on top of? Is that like the best thing that we can do for our AI friends, is to be like beating on the same drum that we've been beating on for the last like 3 decades? I mean, is it really that simple, Larry? What do you think?
I don't know that it's that simple, but it's, I was just thinking about, I bet Deborah can speak to this. I was just thinking about that, fundamentally it's about like communication, but communicating in a digital environment, you need to build stuff on the fly, and you can't do that with unstructured or semi-structured content. And that's what's running through my mind right now, is trying to sort out, and like you said, the main thing I was just feeling right now is compassion for the people who are forced to work in like, crummy CMSs or, or systems that don't give you that opportunity to structure things the way you'd like to. So you're kind of doing post hoc structure with like, you know, SEO meta, like, well, linked data, you know, markup for web pages to show, to kind of indicate what they're about with kind of limited utility, but at least there's some, I don't know, this kind of comes back to that divide between the knowledge, like what Marion just said about the knowledge management and knowledge representation, is that leap from unstructured to precisely structured is so huge. It's like an exponential leap in what you can do with the information. And I don't know how we get there, like how we get, yeah, Deborah.
Oh yeah, I was just thinking, so it was funny that someone brought up the what was it, free share or freebase in the channel. How could I forget that name? Because when Google bought that 10 years ago is when I was working in search, and we would actually go in and try to tweak the freebase data to not to just to help our brand show up, be like, get the right data in there if it's wrong. And then Google closed that off, and it wasn't like, it used to be kind of like a Wikipedia thing, and then I believe it got closed off and we couldn't touch that anymore. But even when working in search 10 years ago, the idea is always they are training these systems to act like human brains. So if you think about the things that make sense for humans first, which are headings and structure and information architecture, like we do that for our brains, not for anyone else's brains. Ideally, the computers will catch up one day. Now we know that computers aren't actually acting like human brains, but even just like this, the passing through the steps of reasoning and the passing through the steps of logic, I think it makes more sense to optimize for the state where, yes, it is going to be smarter, but right now it's not as smart. I guess that's kind of where I'm at, where it's like have always been skating, like if you're skating where the puck is going to be, the puck is, they want to make these like humans, so if we optimize for humans, then that makes more sense than not.
Interesting perspective. Yeah, I really like that. Dina, how about you?
Yeah, I'm picking up where you're leaving off, Deborah, because I've worked, and I think a lot of people have worked in structured data and unstructured data. And when structured data kind of, when we all started using it, my background is technical writing. We were all so excited because it's like, oh, once we have this, we're going to be able to find anything. We're going to be able to do anything. And we just didn't use it the way that, or most humans don't use it the way that we had carefully constructed, our structured data and our structured, documents. So what ended up happening was, all of these carefully planned things just kind of flew by the wayside, and people were back into their Word documents and their wikis and, just doing anything untagged all over the place. So I think that what we're aiming towards is getting the machines to recognize what we mean and making that structure out of our chaos, because and I study this, I study knowledge maintenance, and it's the idea that we create these systems, we don't use them, then we create another system that's going to be, now this one's going to work, which is why organizations have 5 wikis within like 10 years. So I think that machines are supposed to be kind of sweeping up what we're putting down.
One thing you just said, right, it reminded me of that meme you see everywhere of like the college campus with the neatly organized sidewalks and people just walking across however they want. I feel like that's often happening with our precisely, tidily structured data and content.
Exactly, and those are called desire paths, and it's our humanity in motion. It's that we can build all of these, great structures and everything else, but we are going to choose the least resistance, which is generally not structuring our thoughts, not putting things away.
Yeah.
Very human at the end of the day. I
It
think
kind of makes me just want to root for humans at every juncture now. It's like, yeah, go mess up my system. Good on you, mate.
Every time you see a desire path, you have to smile,
That's true. That's true. I think Maring is bringing up something in the chat just about like kind of how do we bring people together around this? Like we all on this call, obviously from a hobbyist perspective, we're all admitting that we're very interested in this. We're starting to see it leaking into our professional lives. But like, how do we actually get, I don't want to say a seat at the table because I feel like we're in different cafeterias at this point. So like, how do we decide where we're actually gonna have lunch and whose table is hosting? And like, how do we get there, Larry? Do you have any insight for like, the crossover that our community could have with other communities that might get us somewhere on this conversation?
Again, I'm laughing that you said it because I'm starting a new job next week as a community growth manager for a knowledge graph company. So
very well timed.
That'll be my job very soon. But no, it's also anybody. I know many people like Dean and I had lunch in Montreal last summer. It's like anybody who in this community who knows me knows that I'm just an incorrigible connector and community person. And so, yeah, I think it's kind of like to what both Maring and Dean have said about like and Deborah about the people part. Like in Deborah's work, she's writing kind of reluctant. I'm going to assume that it's reluctantly for machines, but mostly for humans. And I think if we all I somehow feel like that's going to get us through all the current like fuss and maybe even chaos or whatever this situation we're in right now is to stay focused on our humanity. And we are just the people to do it. And one of the reasons I'm so enamored of the knowledge community and the symbolic AI and knowledge representation world is there's way more women and humanities peoples in there than any other. And these are all nerdy engineers at heart, but there's way more representation of the kinds of backgrounds that we have. And so this is where kind of my point in that slide with the language meme was that like, I don't know exactly. So I can't answer your question exactly. Like, I don't know exactly how we get back in the same cafeteria, but we all need to keep our eyes and ears open with our skill sets and our abilities and our human centeredness in mind, and just look for the opportunities. Because I think my friend was right this morning about the hubris of a lot of engineers. I have a lot of frustrating conversations myself. Half my friends are machine learning engineers, and I'm like, oh, come on, a lot. But they're human beings too. That's the other part of it. You got to acknowledge their thing and their situation and where they're coming from and what they're doing. So I think just honoring our humanity and looking, if you can meet somebody in the courtyard and say, hey, come over to my cafeteria, I think that's going to be how we find the new. Because the other thing, and just a quick aside, like I did a year ago, I did a third podcast about content and AI. And talked a lot, I kind of dropped that one to focus on the knowledge representation stuff, but something that came up over and over in at least half of the conversations I had was to the extent that when people do get exposed to like executives or machine learning engineers or data scientists or data engineers or whatever, as soon as you have one conversation, they're like, oh, you know about that stuff. So I feel like that's, maybe being a little more social than, I don't know, we're all good at this stuff already. But I feel like just being out there, being ourselves, representing ourselves, and it's like so easy to mope right now. It's just so grim in the content and design worlds, especially that, but it's like, I'm very confident that a lot of many of these mass layoffs and stingy hiring policies are just going to bite enterprises in the butt, and they're going to become, crying for help, I think, because this language models are not going to fix that, and knowledge graphs alone won't fix it either. It's like that's a whole, like I said, that's a hard world to get into, in detail, because that's like the best practitioners really do all have PhDs and deep experience in description logic and all the stuff that underlies this. But at the same time, and the company I'm going to work for does this, is sort of like you're beginning to see democratization of the tooling because we're all good at like aligning stakeholders around terminology and concepts and just ensconcing that in a way that computers can work with it too. That's all we're doing. And that's just going to get more, I think it's just going to keep getting not easier, but more doable. It's never going to be easy to align human beings on language and anything.
Never. I feel like the slide with the history, I don't know what your axes were set up as. I know that one was time, but whatever the other one was, you had us going into like a deep chasm. And I felt like that was very, I don't know if that was your intention, but it feels like there's like another half of that chart. And I'm picturing that like, this is like, we're in the depths right now and we're going to pull up, you know, like it feels very hopeful that maybe we'll be able to pull up from whatever that deep.
Well, that's like another Gartner model that you see all the time is the hype cycle, which somebody pointed out recently is exactly the same as the Dunning-Kruger effect. You know, yeah, exactly. But basically there's this inflated expectations and then the peak of excitement and then the plunge into the trough of despair. And then you pull back out into like, and eventually on the plateau of enlightenment or something like that. But it's like, but yeah, and it does feel like we're in that trough right now.
Yeah, we are. We're in the messy middle. Like none of us quite know what to do. And we're trying to prepare for whatever's ahead. But all we've got is a bunch of free tools and a bunch of people doing a land grab for how this is all going to work out. Like it really does feel like the messy middle right now.
Yeah,
I'm glad that we have this many people from this diverse an audience on a call, all like on the same page about that. I personally feel better. I feel less behind having had this conversation in this group. So thank you for that. And we are coming to the end of our hour.
Oh, wow. That was quick.
I know it went so fast. It's always fun to see the time clip on by. That means that we're having a good time. So does anybody have any closing thoughts before we thank Larry and hype the club a little and let y'all go? Any last minute things? No. All right, just to let you know, we did record this. So if anybody's like, oh man, I need to listen to that again and take notes this time, we will be sending that out. So that is definitely available to you. And also, I just want to encourage you to check out the club. We do conversations every single weekday. We have on average more like 9 to 11 people on a call. So this is a very large call for us. So typically everybody does have a chance to have their voice heard. We have different topic every day. We have 40 discussion leaders that are all trained to provide welcoming and inclusive environments to have those discussions. And we love to, as part of you all being here, offer you a special discount. So if you use the code special guest, you will get 50% off your first 3 months with us. And we really hope to see a couple of you take our opportunity up. And with that, I will close down this room. Please leave a note in the chat on your way out of what you're taking away from this. We love to listen to all of your feedback. You can also send me any private feedback you want through email or DM if you'd like. You guys are awesome. Thank you for being here. And Larry, thank you. You are a shepherd. Like we're so lucky to have you in this community and you continue to give. So thank you so much for this.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I love a good conversation and this was a great one.
This was a really good one. Thank you all. Have a great rest of your day.
Cheers, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.